The subject of our program today is Black History Month. Each year, February is designated for the study of the impact, the influence of Black Americans and all of Black history. I'm Arthur Starr. Welcome to Thinking Out Loud. My guests today are the president of the Manchester chapter, New Hampshire chapter, I guess, of the NAACP, Sandra Hicks. Sandy, welcome to Thinking Out Loud.
Thank you for having us.
Is it the
here
Manchester
today.
chapter?
It's the Manchester chapter.
But it encompasses the whole.
There is a chapter in Portsmouth.
There's a chapter in Portsmouth.
Somewhat inactive sometimes, but.
Okay. And Bernard Street, who is the public information representative of the Baha'i Faith in Manchester. Bernie, welcome to Thinking Out Loud.
Thank you.
Why do we have Black History Month? That's a good question. We'll start with that. Why is there a Black History Month?
No.
Well, let me read something from the paper recently, and that will give you an idea why I think Black history is important. A survey released by the National Opinion Research Center not long ago suggests that whites generally have a low opinion of blacks and other minorities, despite the fact white support for racial equality has sharply improved. The traditional racial stereotypes appear to be stronger than ever, with most whites believing blacks are less hardworking, more violence-prone, less intelligent, less patriotic, and likely to prefer living on welfare. It's my opinion that many white Americans' prejudice is based on blind imitation of the past. And if there's a feeling of not much worth in African Americans, that they had no history, that they are not important, that they are only sort of adjuncts to the American scene, then there's no respect. It's interesting because if we were to turn the clock back 130 years ago, those same adjectives were stated in the paper and in the minds of most Americans
As fact.
as fact relative to the Irish immigrants. So with each wave of immigrants, the same stereotypes seem to apply. But why Black history? I think it's as important for whites as it is for black people that the African was really a person of worth. He was not a savage. And I think they need to know that he came from complex social and economic societies in Africa. He was the first to discover iron. He developed stringed instruments without any contact from Asia or Europe, that he domesticated animals, and he was a skillful artisan and had languages and sciences and inventions prior to American Negro slavery.
The portrayal, though, in the article, that, that talks of the survey of opinions or beliefs of Americans, white Americans towards blacks, where do they come from? I mean, I'm asking this kind of rhetorically because I think I know the answer, but where do they come from? I mean, why have they been perpetuated?
There's a problem with our education system in the fact that the students today, unless they go to a school where there is a Black Studies program, there's been very little integrated. Children hear about Booker T. Washington and a few other names.
George Washington Carver.
Right. But as a whole, they don't have a broad sense of the multi-ethnic, multi-racial background of the founding of this country.
But I think a lot of it also, Bernie, you were talking about what the blacks did in Africa, what the Africans did in terms of iron and culture and things they developed. For the most part in the United States, what we have known, and I agree it's somewhat the fault of the education system that many of these myths and things have been perpetuated, not that the schools teach them, but they don't teach otherwise.
Right. Okay,
I don't think they're being taught. And that was, in fact, the experience of the blacks in the United States, the African Americans who came here as slaves, as undereducated, as poor, as being on someone's welfare list. That was the experience they were forced into, and that image has portrayed, not because someone's teaching it, but no one's teaching the other side of the coin, that there has been a growth, there has been a development, there has been a change. I don't think, and I offer this as my own personal opinion, I don't think the jokes that some make about blacks are the reason for it. Because if you look at ethnic jokes about Poles, about Frenchmen, about Jews against Irishmen, Italians, it's the same joke. You just change the names.
That's right.
Okay, you just change the person. Every joke that's against the Poles today was once an anti-Italian joke, was an anti-Irish joke, was an anti-Jewish joke. You just change the person.
That's right.
You know, you can tell the same joke by saying these two ethnics were walking down the street, and you can fill in whatever you want for ethnics. And so I think the same thing's true about blacks in this country. The difference being that blacks are obviously much more identifiable than an Irishman or an Italian or a Jew or a Frenchman and so forth. But I don't think it's the jokes that are perpetuated. I'm not against telling ethnic jokes. I think that, you know, humor is humor. I get a guy like Don Rickles who gets up and insults everybody across the board, and he's funny. Now, when he tells the one joke about the blacks, you might not think it's quite so funny. I meant like the one about the Jews. But he's doing it all as a sense of humor. So I don't blame humor on putting people down. I think it's the fact that, Sandy, as you said, perhaps we haven't taught the real things and instead have perpetuated what we knew was true 150, 200 years ago. Does that wash? I mean, is that a reasonable approach to it?
I think that's some of it. I think it's important for every ethnic group to be able, as a part of a nation, which we are here, to look to the heroes, to see themselves represented
Pride.
in the history of that country.
Sure.
Which is not easily done here. We hear about the entertainers and the athletes.
Right.
We don't hear about the surgeons. We don't hear about the lawyers. We don't hear as much, well, we hear more today than we used to, of the politicians who are black, of the educators, of the writers. We're all there, and they have been there for many, many years.
And yet I have to tell you, as a white person talking to you, Sandy, I've known you for many years, so I'm not uncomfortable saying it. For me to point to David Dinkins in New York or General Colin Powell in Washington almost sounds like I'm patronizing. They're not the only ones.
Exactly, but I'm
Okay.
saying those are people you see in the news today.
Exactly.
I'm talking about what do you know about the history of other people.
Right.
In fact, who was involved with plasma.
Mhm.
I have loads of information that's readily available. Every year, as a member of the NAACP, I get phone calls from parents who are concerned that they don't get any kind of information from their students as to happenings in the school around Black History Month. And they want to know what they can do to either approach the teacher or have their student in that school ask questions. I've had some organizations this past year call and say, we'd like to do something, what should we do? And I give them a few names. I don't do their work for them. I give them some names and send them off in a direction to do the discovery themselves, which is important to do. And those calls are becoming more and more. And there's a lot of frustration of families who have been here in the state for a number of years who see repeatedly, year after year, very little is done in the schools. And this is the one time they feel like we should be at least able to then focus a little more additional attention around some of the things that we know, who know our history, are able to celebrate. And we want to share that with the class. We want to share that with the people around us.
This really started in, I guess it was the late 50s, early 60s with the concept of Black is Beautiful. And, you know, the rediscovery of individual worth and identity through the culture that you've shared. And it spilled over into every other community as well. Okay? I mean, it hit the Jewish community, it hit the Irish, it hit everyone has that need that you started with, Sandy, to say that a sense of pride in who I am and where I came from. And no, you know, the Black American, the Afro-American can trace his roots back probably 2 generations, or perhaps 3 at most, when he was a slave. But didn't we all come from that? I mean, the Jews were slaves in Egypt. So, you know, all of us were slaves somewhere and eventually developed into our own self-worth. We have to stop and take a break. When we come back, though, I want to ask a question and, in fact, make a statement that you may or may not agree with. Concerning the discussion, I don't want to say the controversy, discussion of a Martin Luther King Day in New Hampshire, and what effect that has on the black community. Does that help with something like Black History Month, even though it would be January, not February? We'll be right back.
What a disgrace, getting drunk like that at your sister's graduation party. You should be ashamed of yourself.
Listen, you'll just cut out the drinking for a week. 1 week. Then we'll talk about raising your allowance. Okay, honey?
What?
Is
A
that
drinking
too much?
problem? He's only 14. He doesn't have a drinking problem. It's a phase.
That's it. The last straw. If you come home drunk again, mister, you are gone out of my house. And don't think I won't do it. Do you hear me? My knees. You have got to stop. I'm begging you. Please.
If your son or daughter has a drinking problem,
You're
You're not alone.
You're a drunk! Just look at you! Look at you! A drunk!
When you think there's nothing else you can do, there is. Help is available. We're the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. We help thousands of people every year. Get through to us, and we'll help you get through to them. Just don't give up.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Bernie Streets and Sandy Hicks, and we're talking about Black American, Afro-American, Black American Month. Where does the term come from? I mean, who designated Black American Month, or Black History Month, I guess it's called?
Well, in 1925, Dr. Carter Woodson, who was a professor of history at Howard University, initiated the first Black History Week. He also, at the same time, started an association for the investigation of Negro culture in America. The purpose of this was to show all Americans that Black Americans had a history, that it was an integral part of American history, which unfortunately was left out of all the textbooks. Secondly, it was to get some type of inspiration and pride in America's Black people that they did have a history, because slavery, the institution of slavery, served to cut off any ties with Africa. A slave could be maimed, killed for just learning how to read and write. They were forbidden to speak any of their native dialects. It was an oppression that tended to drive any cultural aspects from their African past out. Yet in spite of this, there were great contributions, and I think Dr. Woodson wanted America to know that because the perception of Black people was that they were less than human. In fact, one of the original justification for the Europeans going into Africa is that the Pope passed a papal bull absolving the Portuguese and Spanish of any religious sin, because it was designated, that papal bull, that these people were not human. Dr. Woodson, PhD from Harvard University, was a contradiction to the stereotype of Negro inferiority, and he wanted to start this as a means for educating America that there was a history and that the information was available. It just was not included into the textbooks.
And from that it's grown to Black History Month.
Yes. It's an awareness.
Who actually sponsors it, or who designates it as Black History? It's just something that happens automatically every February.
Yes, it originally got presidential approval going back to President Roosevelt for Negro History Week, and the terms have changed because America's Black people have chosen to designate themselves. Now the popular term is African American, and I think simply because it has a point of reference. Black means nothing, as white means nothing.
No, Black has a negative connotation to it.
Yes, it has a negative connotation, but...
Ever since the Westerns, where the good guys wore white hats and the bad guys wore black hats.
Yes, that's right.
It's always a matter of black and white, okay? And white is always good, black is always bad.
That's right,
But that
exactly.
was a white connotation.
Exactly, exactly. But it still has that connotation to it,
Yes.
sure.
And that's why the Black is Beautiful became a movement,
way of
because it was
countering that.
important for people to balance that. As Dr. Woodson began that Negro History Week to inspire others, is a perfect example of this year's Martin Luther King winner was Valerie Cunningham from Portsmouth. And she is a historian for New Hampshire and has studied back and investigated and has done a wonderful paper that is in the Historical Society, where she went back to the 1700s to gather information about New Hampshire's Black population.
Which is really relatively small, I mean, percentage-wise.
In 1707 there were 70, and in 1715 there were 150, and by the mid-70s, maybe 75, there were about 656, and by the 1800s there were 864. In 1779, 19 slaves petitioned New Hampshire legislation for freedom for themselves and for all slaves, and it made the Portsmouth paper. And then 3 weeks when it went for a vote, it was tabled.
What is the Black population in New Hampshire now?
Presently, the
percent or
actual
numbers?
figures are not in. Our census is
I almost wish
a
they
little
weren't.
over 1 million, And the estimate is that we're about 2%. Those numbers aren't firm yet. That we probably will have some firm numbers mid-April.
You're almost giving me a segue right into my question that I wanted to come back to on the Martin Luther King Day discussion and the bill that, at least as we tape this, is currently before the legislature, the three different bills. But over the years, it has been a source of controversy. And first, let me ask you, do you think we are now one of only 2 states that don't observe Martin Luther King Day? Was it Montana or Wyoming?
Montana has declared theirs
has
already.
declared theirs.
It's
Idaho.
It's Arizona.
Oh, Arizona and New Hampshire, that's correct.
Right.
Arizona and New Hampshire. Is it because there isn't, is it a political discussion? Because the black population is, after all, so small, it's really insignificant, and I don't mean in terms of people, in terms of its impact on an election, and therefore there's no great lobbying effort on the Senate or the House to pass it. Is that
This bill has come up repeatedly year after year, and there have been myths perpetuated as to why that would be a problem. Certainly there are those who are against a Martin Luther King holiday per se. The 3 bills that have come forward, one is to make a Civil Rights Day, the other is to make it a Sunday holiday, and the other is the bill which I supported, in which the Martin Luther King Day Coalition has sponsored, in sponsorship with the legislators, which is Senate Bill 229, which asks that it be the 3rd Monday of January, which is the same national celebration for the most part, and that it be Martin Luther King Rights Day. And a lot of it has to do with concern, certainly, that with the economy, that an additional holiday would be a problem. This would not make it a problem. This would be in exchange for Fast Day, which is somewhat
very widely observed in this state now.
Right, which is a floating holiday.
Fast.
And certainly that makes me feel good, because it allows for the freedom of choice. Being a behind myself, I look at some of the holidays that we celebrate, and if I was still in the workforce today, I would be concerned that there are days that I would maybe prefer to work that wouldn't mean as much to me, and I'd like to be able to have a floating holiday where I could choose which days to celebrate. And so that allows people the option with the Martin Luther King Day holiday as a floating holiday to take it off or not, and it would not cost.
I guess the statement I would make, and we're going to stop and take a break after this and maybe come back and pick up on it, is that I, from the very beginning, have not seen the idea of a Martin Luther King Day as something that would be established because it's important for the black community to have a hero to identify with, as we've had Washington's birthday or Lincoln's birthday now combined as a President's Day. Because I don't see Martin Luther King as a hero for black people, but for a hero for all peoples who are subjected. It's not a matter of race, and that's why I disagree with some of the people who say, well, you know, we don't have something for this person or that person. Here's a person who went far beyond the confines of his own small ethnic racial group, with an influence far beyond that I think affects so many of us in our lives.
Absolutely.
And
when
our
you
whole society.
think that 48 states and many, many nations and other countries celebrate it, tells you that not just the small percentage of blacks are the only ones who feel that this is a man and who should be honored by a day. And it's his dream. It's what he stood for. Certainly he was human, and no one's going to disagree with the fact that we all have fallacies. But the things that he stood for, what he gave up his life for, what he lived for, those are the things that we need to be reminded about, and to have it be a holiday. No, it was human rights, which affect all of us.
Okay, we'll be right back after this break.
When my husband died, my family was very concerned about me living alone. I didn't want to go to a nursing home.
Came here was because I was living alone. Things have worked out just well for me. Everything that I
was so
wanted.
Concerned about Mom after Dad passed away, having to take care of herself.
The Supportive Services Program coordinates transportation, meals, housekeeping, and activities at senior housing complexes. The Supportive Services Program, helping seniors maintain their independence.
Tonight, Dolores had a few drinks, did some crack, and ended up another tragic story. Only she doesn't know it yet. Drugs make you forget. And if you forget how risky sex can be, you could catch the AIDS virus and not know it for months, even years. AIDS, another way drugs can kill.
Welcome back. Sandy Hicks and Bernie Streets and I are speaking about Black History Month. And just before we went on the break, Bernie, you said you wanted to say something, and I cut you off before we had a chance. We were talking about Martin Luther King and the celebration of the observance of Martin Luther King Day. And I would give you the opportunity to say, I don't know if you're going to counter what I was going to say or what.
I look on Martin Luther King Jr. as an American who just happened to be black, who believed in the American dream, who never lost faith in it. Our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence were very important to him, and all he asked is that America follow those words in those documents. Everything he talked about had to do with justice and freedom, and either we believe in those words or else we just don't. He saw that the destiny of America was a great one, that it would not proceed into further greatness unless it resolved the racial issues that plague us. He was a human being, and I think his place in history, if he as a peacemaker, as someone who is espousing justice for all and for equality for all people, I would certainly think that if we as Americans believe in our Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, that we should focus on that rather than his being, by accident of birth, black.
That's something you can take pride in, but that's not the reason for the...
And is not necessarily a spokesman for just a portion of the American people.
Which leads to maybe a controversial point. I don't know. I don't intend it to be as such. Very often, and Cindy referred to something like this before. You talked about having pride in people who were in our history, not just the current people who, you know, a David Dinks in New York, or Jesse Jackson. Oh, well, see, Jesse Jackson becomes a controversial issue. I'm sure Mayor Dinks is in New York also, or the athlete, or General Powell. But then you do get a Jesse Jackson, and I have great admiration and respect for Jesse Jackson, but he is a controversial person. I mean, he said things that inflame a good percentage of the population, maybe more than half the population. And yet he said things that, you know, certainly many of us admire and approve. Or you get someone like Louis Farrakhan, who has, you know, inflamed passions on almost any issue you want from different perspectives, where some people either love him or hate him for it. I guess my problem that I have is I don't see Louis Farrakhan as the spokesman for the black community any more than David Duke represents the spokesman for the white community, or Rabbi Meir Kahane represented the Jewish community, but as people who have a right to feel the way they want to feel. And, you know, yes, I guess if the black community 100% said we love Louis Farrakhan, I'd have a great deal of difficulty relating with people that I know who are black. Okay, if that's how they really felt. As I'm sure you wouldn't particularly care if I was a total supporter of Meir Kahane, because I'm not, and I don't think I'm friendly with people who are total supporters of his. And yet he made many contributions too, as has Jesse Jackson or any of the others.
You know, I guess I don't really...
It's looking for the hero who is the perfect person, and it doesn't exist.
I don't think it's so much the hero, it's recognizing yourself as a part of the whole package. And that's why having
like the blind people touching the elephant.
When you're in a community where you don't have a lot of diversity, it doesn't allow you the opportunity to become aware of people who are part of that whole system and contributors in the same vein, because you don't have those people around you. That's why it's important to have history. For us, I brought some books that I can give you the titles of that would help one get some background information. For us as Baha'is, I think that's part of the reason why we look forward to and plan around Race Unity Day. Here in New Hampshire, it allows us to be participants and sponsors of an activity that brings people of wide diversity together just to spend time in a celebratory, informative way. And that's necessary, because I've traveled around this country and lived many different places, and so often it's been people in their life experience have not had exposure to someone different than themselves in general, be it religious, color. And it's important because that's how we grow, and that's how we begin to really benefit, because we are at a loss when we know little about people of different backgrounds. But it's also important as an individual to have a sense of your cultural history. That helps you begin to feel like you have an identity to live up to. I think having raised children, have grandchildren coming up, I know looking at them, they want to know about their heritage. They want to feel good about that. They want to have something to look towards and to feel that their ancestors had a place in history, contributed in positive ways, because our media projects so much negative.
But let's come full cycle now back to where we started in the last few minutes that we have. Understanding a need for African Americans to develop a sense of pride in their heritage, their history, where they came from and who they are today. You've got to go beyond that somehow, and I know, you know, as we'll be viewed, February is over, Black History Month is over already, but what do you do to overcome the myths that we started with, to teach them to the rest of the population? No question that the self comes first, in this case the Black community, have to overcome those things that have been perpetuated in their own families too, that we are lazy, we are less human, and there are people still espousing that. We've heard them from podiums in universities before who are espousing the fact that blacks are an inferior race and so forth. How do we get that? What do you do with Black History Month, or now that it's over even, the rest of the community who is not black, who perpetuates those myths because they don't know any better?
I think that if someone believes this, you know, that's their problem. I look at their children and going to school, and I think that's a place. Just think of the joy a young black student or even a young Jewish student would have when they find that in colonial America, two of the primary people who financed the Revolutionary War period were black Samuel Francis and a Jewish American named Chaim Solomon. And I dare say that there are so many people that don't know that, and they don't know that there were over 5,000 blacks in the Continental Army. And I think that this helps to destroy the stereotypes.
You almost have to give up on the parent generation and start with the new ones.
I think if they believe that, but you know, false information had to do with cranial capacity or the size of the brain, and it was said, and many people, even in modern times, believe that blacks are less inferior because they have smaller cranial capacities and therefore brains. There was a study done on 100 Nigerian men which supported that supposedly in the negative. Yet Albert Einstein's brain was 650 cubic centimeters, one of the smallest, and certainly one of the most brilliant people in history.
Well said.
So.
And a great way to end. I know we want to talk about women and black women next month, and March being Women's Month. We're out of time. I want to thank you for coming today, both of you, for joining us today, and thank all of you who watched and joined us on Thinking Out Loud.